The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the desolate landscape. The once thriving city was now a crumbling skeleton of its former self, its streets littered with debris and the broken remnants of a world that had long since collapsed. A constant, unyielding wind swept through the empty buildings, carrying with it the stench of decay and death. In the heart of this wasteland, a small group of survivors huddled together, their faces grim and exhausted. For the past year, they had fought tooth and nail to stay alive in a world overrun by the infected. The zombies were relentless, always hungry, always on the move. But it wasn't just the undead they had to worry about. The remnants of humanity, desperate and fractured, were just as dangerous. The survivors, led by a former military officer named Captain Sarah Mitchell, had managed to find a temporary refuge in an abandoned shopping mall. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep the worst of the dangers at bay. Still, even here, safety was a fleeting illusion. Resources were running out, and every day brought a new threat. The mall had been raided multiple times by other scavengers, and supplies were becoming scarce. Food, water, and ammunition, everything they needed to survive, were in short supply. Sarah stood by the shattered window, her hand resting lightly on the cold, cracked glass as she surveyed the surrounding area. The faint sounds of distant moans from the infected carried on the wind, but the real threat was closer. The sound of boots crunching on broken glass echoed in the silence, and Sarah turned, alert. Her team gathered around her, their faces weary but determined. Beside her stood Derek, a young medic who had become like a brother to her over the past months. His eyes were bloodshot, his movements slow from exhaustion, but his hands never stopped moving, always adjusting his gear or checking his medical supplies. Next to him was Maria, a sharpshooter who had joined the group just a few weeks ago after the fall of another enclave. Her presence was both an asset and a mystery. She kept mostly to herself, but her eyes, dark and intense, spoke volumes of the horrors she had seen. And then there was Ethan, the group's mechanic. He was tall and stocky, always with a hint of humor in his voice even when times were dire. His skills with machines had kept the group's few vehicles running, and his knowledge of the inner workings of the mall had proven invaluable in securing their base. "We can't stay here much longer," Sarah said, her voice quiet but firm. "We've got one shot at this. We need to find more supplies, and we need to do it now." The group exchanged uneasy glances. It wasn't the first time Sarah had proposed a dangerous mission into the heart of the wasteland, but this time felt different. This time, it was a matter of survival. "We'll make a plan," Maria said, her voice low. "We have to be careful, though. The city's crawling with both zombies and people. We can't trust anyone anymore." "We know," Sarah replied, nodding. "But if we don't act now, there won't be anything left for us to scavenge. We either find what we need or we're done." Ethan spoke up, his voice full of the quiet confidence that had earned him the group's trust. "I'll get the vehicles ready. But we'll need to move fast. The longer we stay out there, the greater the risk." Derek nodded, already checking his medical kit. "I'll make sure we're prepared for anything. If we find a safe place, I'll be ready to patch us up." The group was silent for a moment, the weight of the decision hanging in the air. There was no going back. If they ventured out into the zombie-infested wasteland, there was a good chance they wouldn't return. But if they stayed, the slow march of starvation and despair would be their final enemy. "Let's move," Sarah said, her voice steely with resolve. "For the last hope we have." With that, the survivors gathered their gear, checking their weapons and supplies one final time. The sound of the wind howling outside seemed to grow louder, as if the world itself was aware of the perilous journey they were about to undertake. Together, they stepped out into the wasteland, ready to face whatever dangers lay ahead. The wind howled like a living thing, carrying the stench of rot and decay as the survivors moved cautiously through the streets of the city. The once bustling urban center was now a ghost town, its skyscrapers looming like silent sentinels over the ruin below. Abandoned vehicles lined the streets, some overturned, others burned to husks. The only movement came from the occasional swarm of zombies dragging their broken bodies through the wreckage. Sarah led the group, her eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. The infected were unpredictable, and the last thing they needed was to be caught off guard. The group moved in tight formation, sticking to the alleyways and avoiding the open streets. Every so often, a faint groan echoed from the distance, a reminder that danger was never far away. "Keep moving," Sarah muttered under her breath, her voice barely a whisper. "We need to make it to the old grocery store a few blocks over. It's our best chance for supplies." Derek, who had been walking just behind her, nodded. His hand was never far from his medical kit, ready to tend to any injuries or infections that might arise. He had grown accustomed to the sight of blood and violence, but it never got easier. Every scream, every death, was a reminder of the world they had lost. And yet, they had survived. For now. Maria's sharp eyes never strayed from their surroundings. She had a sixth sense for spotting danger, and it was a skill that had saved them more times than she cared to count. Every so often, she would stop, hold up a hand, and they would freeze, waiting for the sound of approaching footsteps or distant groans. It was like walking a razor's edge, one misstep, and they could all be lost. Ethan, ever the optimist, was the last in the line, keeping an eye on their rear. His normally upbeat demeanor was noticeably absent, replaced by a focused intensity. The world had a way of stripping away layers of comfort and safety, leaving only the raw, survival-driven instinct. He made sure the group was still intact, every member accounted for. His fingers lingered over the keys of his radio, a lifeline to the rest of the world that had long since gone silent. The minutes dragged by, each one stretching longer than the last as they inched closer to their destination. Then, as they turned a corner, the store came into view. It was a hulking, decaying building, its windows shattered and its entrance barricaded by rusted metal sheets. From this distance, it looked safe, abandoned, untouched. But appearances were often deceiving. "Is it clear?" Maria asked, her voice tense as she scanned the area. Sarah nodded. "Looks like it. We go in, grab what we can, and get out. Fast." They moved forward, weapons drawn, eyes constantly shifting from one potential threat to the next. The door was partially ajar, the rusted metal creaking as Sarah pushed it open. The smell inside was worse than anything they had encountered outside, a mix of spoiled food, mildew, and the unmistakable stench of death. But it was quiet. Too quiet. The group stepped inside, the sound of their boots echoing in the vast, empty space. Shelves lined the walls, some still stocked with cans of food, others completely bare. A few rows of water bottles remained, though it was hard to tell how much of it was still good. Derek moved first, inspecting the items with clinical efficiency, tossing what was spoiled and grabbing anything that could be used. "We need more," he muttered as he dug through a shelf. "This won't last long." Ethan moved over to the next aisle, his flashlight illuminating cans of soup and packaged snacks that seemed almost untouched. "There's more here. If we're lucky, we might get out with a decent haul." But as Sarah surveyed the shelves, a low growl echoed through the store. A chill ran down her spine. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a stray zombie. This sound was closer. Much closer. "Get ready," she whispered. The group tensed, ready for anything. But before they could react, the sound of shuffling footsteps reached their ears, followed by the unmistakable moans of the infected. Sarah's hand instinctively reached for her weapon, her heart racing. The silence was shattered in an instant as the first zombie stumbled into view, its eyes vacant and hungry. And it wasn't alone. The group was surrounded. The zombies emerged from the aisles like shadows in the dim light, their vacant eyes fixed on the survivors with a mindless hunger. A low groan echoed from one of them as it lurched forward, its decayed flesh hanging off its bones like tattered rags. Another staggered from behind a stack of boxes, its arms stretched out toward the group with unnatural speed. Sarah's pulse quickened, but her training kicked in. "Weapons up," she shouted, already taking aim at the closest zombie. Her hand tightened around the grip of her pistol, her aim steady as she fired a shot directly into the creature's head. It collapsed, its body hitting the floor with a sickening thud. Maria was already beside her, her rifle in hand, and in a fluid motion, she dispatched the next two zombies with deadly precision. Each shot was clean, quick, and efficient. The two women had fought together for months, and their bond in the heat of battle was unspoken, their movements a perfect mirror of each other's instincts. Derek, while not as seasoned in combat as Sarah and Maria, was no slouch either. He pulled out his knife with a practiced hand and rushed forward to tackle the nearest infected. The blade drove deep into its skull, silencing it instantly. His breath came in sharp bursts, but his focus never wavered. He wasn't just fighting for survival, he was fighting for his team. Ethan, who had initially been more concerned with the supplies, was now fully engaged in the fight. He swung a crowbar, connecting with a zombie's skull, the force of the blow sending it tumbling backward. "I didn't sign up for this," he muttered through gritted teeth, but his aim was deadly as he quickly finished off another oncoming zombie. For a brief moment, it seemed like they might be able to clear the store, but the groans were growing louder. More and more zombies were appearing from the back rooms, pouring into the aisles. The survivors were quickly surrounded, and the air was thick with the stench of rotting flesh. "Damn it!" Sarah shouted as she spun to take out another approaching zombie, her hands moving with a practiced fluidity. "We need to get to the back exit. Now!" Maria turned, her eyes scanning the room for the safest escape route. "There's a loading dock on the far side of the store. We can make it if we're fast." With no time to waste, Sarah motioned for the group to fall back toward the loading dock. But as they started to retreat, the group was met with resistance. One of the zombies lunged toward Ethan, its gnarled hands grabbing at his leg. He yelped in surprise, kicking it off as he tried to keep his balance, but another zombie grabbed hold of his arm, sinking its teeth into his flesh. "Ethan!" Derek cried, rushing toward him, but Sarah was faster. She sprinted forward, grabbing Ethan's arm and yanking him away from the infected. "Get him to the dock!" Sarah barked. She swung her rifle into position and fired, taking down the zombie that had bitten Ethan, but not before a few of its teeth had already pierced his skin. Ethan's face twisted in pain as blood dripped from the wound, but he gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay on his feet. "I'm fine," he muttered through clenched teeth. "Just go. Don't let them get us." Derek was already pulling out a field dressing, but Sarah was resolute. "We'll patch you up when we're out of here. Keep moving." They rushed toward the loading dock, their footsteps heavy on the broken floor tiles. Behind them, the groans of the infected grew louder, a reminder that time was quickly running out. The loading dock doors were just ahead, but they were locked. "Move it!" Sarah shouted, slamming her shoulder into the door. With a creak, it gave way, and the survivors spilled into the alley behind the store. For a moment, they breathed in the cool, polluted air, feeling the relief of escaping the store, but it was short-lived. As they moved further into the alley, a new threat emerged. A group of scavengers, dressed in ragged clothing and armed with makeshift weapons, stepped into their path. The leader of the group, a tall, wiry man with a scar across his face, sneered at them. "You think you can just take what's ours?" he hissed, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the survivors. "This is our territory now." Sarah's heart sank. They were already running low on supplies, and now they had to face another danger: hostile humans. The Wasteland was a brutal place, and sometimes people were more dangerous than the zombies. The leader of the scavengers stood with a smug grin, his eyes glinting with malice as he sized up the survivors. Behind him, a handful of his crew, equally armed with crude weapons, baseball bats, knives, and a few rusted pistols, shifted uneasily, clearly sizing up the group. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Step aside," Sarah said, her voice cold, trying to keep her composure. Her pistol was already in her hand, though she kept it lowered for now, careful not to provoke the group. Ethan's arm was still bleeding from the bite, and she knew they didn't have much time before infection could set in. The scavenger leader scoffed, his gaze flicking to Ethan's wound. "You think we don't see that? You're already weak, already marked." You want to walk away from this? He let out a short, bitter laugh. We're taking everything you've got. Your weapons, your supplies, your food. It's not your world anymore. Derek, who had been trying to stay in the background and help Ethan, stepped forward, a glint of fire in his eyes. You'll have to kill us first, he said, his voice low but firm. His medical instincts screamed at him to tend to Ethan, but he knew there wasn't time. If they fought, they might survive. If they didn't fight, they'd be left to rot, either by infection or starvation. Maria stepped up beside him, her rifle now raised slightly, her finger just above the trigger. She didn't speak, but her stance said everything, ready for anything. She didn't trust these scavengers any more than Sarah did, and she wouldn't hesitate to fire if it came down to it. The scavenger leader's grin faltered slightly when he saw Maria's rifle, but he quickly recovered. You think you can threaten us? I've dealt with your kind before. Just hand over your supplies, and we'll make it quick. Sarah held his gaze, calculating. She didn't want to fight, she needed the scavengers to be afraid of them, to know that they were willing to do whatever it took to survive. A fight meant more injury, more bloodshed, and more risk. But if they didn't fight, there was a chance they'd lose everything. Just let us go, she said, her tone hardening. We don't want trouble. We just need to get to the next supply point. The leader sneered. Nice try. I know what you're really after. You think you can just walk away from us with what's ours? Before Sarah could respond, Ethan, despite the pain, gritted his teeth and staggered forward, his hands held up to show he wasn't armed. His voice was hoarse but steady. We don't want to fight. But if you want to take what's ours, you'll have to kill us first. The leader's eyes narrowed, looking at the bloody wound on Ethan's arm. You're already dead, he muttered, nodding to one of his men. The thug grinned, advancing slowly toward Ethan with a crowbar in hand. It was a standoff now. Every member of Sarah's group was tense, their fingers twitching near weapons. The scavengers took a step closer, their movements deliberate and threatening. Without warning, the first blow came. The thug with the crowbar swung it at Ethan, aiming to knock him to the ground. But Sarah was quicker. In one fluid motion, she raised her pistol and fired a shot, the bullet slamming into the thug's shoulder. He screamed, dropping the crowbar and stumbling backward. The scavenger leader barked out an order, and the group rushed forward, clearly ready to fight. But Sarah's team wasn't backing down. Maria's rifle came up, and she fired, knocking another scavenger to the ground. Derek, his hand still tight on his medical kit, swung into action, grabbing a nearby pipe and using it as a weapon to bash a third scavenger in the face. The fight broke out in a blur of movement and chaos. Sarah was in the center, ducking behind a dumpster as one of the scavengers charged at her. She dodged the swing of his axe and countered with a quick jab, knocking him off balance and sending him crashing into the alley wall. Move! Get to the vehicles, she shouted, urging her team to make for the entrance they'd come through. They couldn't afford to stay and fight too long. But just as they were making progress toward the alley exit, the leader lunged forward, slashing with a knife. He caught Sarah's arm, drawing blood, but she gritted her teeth through the pain, ducking under his next strike. This ends now, he hissed. With a swift motion, Maria aimed her rifle and fired once more, catching the leader in the leg. He crumpled, his knife slipping from his hand as he screamed in agony. Without hesitation, Sarah grabbed Derek's arm, pulling him toward the alley entrance. Go! Now! The survivors rushed toward their makeshift vehicles, barely dodging more swings from the remaining scavengers. As they made it to safety, Derek quickly pulled out his field dressing to treat Ethan's wound. He had no time for anything more than a hurried wrap, but it would have to do for now. We're not out of this yet, Sarah muttered, eyes scanning the darkening horizon. They had made it out of the fight alive, but in a world like this, it was never over until they were safe. The roar of the engine filled the air as Sarah gunned the accelerator, pushing their vehicle down the narrow, debris-strewn alley. Behind them, the sounds of the scavengers' shouts and the distant growls of zombies faded, but the tension remained thick in the air. the group barely had time to think about what had just happened. They were all exhausted, covered in the grime of battle and the weight of their injuries. Ethan's arm, still wrapped in makeshift bandages, had turned a sickly shade of purple. His breathing was shallow, his face pale, but he refused to acknowledge the pain. He was determined to make it out alive. Derek was focused on him, his hands moving methodically over the field dressing as the vehicle jolted over uneven pavement. "You need more care than this," Derek muttered, glancing up from his makeshift patch. "I'll have to dig deeper when we're in a safe place." Ethan, however, just shrugged, his voice weak. "As long as I don't turn into one of them. I'm good." Maria was quiet, her face hard, but her eyes flickered with concern. Her rifle was still in hand, her grip steady as she scanned their rearview mirror for any sign of pursuit. "I'm not so sure about that," she said softly, her tone guarded. "You're one bite away from becoming their next meal. And we all know how fast infection spreads." "We can't think about that right now," Sarah interjected, her voice sharp. She kept her eyes focused on the road ahead. "We need to get to the supply point before dark. It's our best shot." Ethan nodded, though the effort seemed to take a toll. He slumped against the side of the truck, eyes drifting shut, but he didn't speak again. The infection was a slow burn, they all knew that. It could be hours before any of them realized if it had taken hold. But the bigger concern right now was what waited ahead. The vehicle rattled over a broken bridge, crossing into a newer section of the city. The buildings here were in better condition, though still in ruins. The occasional flicker of movement caught Sarah's eye, figures scurrying across the street, hiding in the shadows. She knew they weren't zombies. The last thing they needed now was more hostile humans. "We'll need to be careful here," Sarah said, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. "There could be more scavengers. More threats." "I thought we were done with them," Derek muttered, his eyes scanning the streets nervously. "Why are they still out here?" Maria looked over her shoulder, her eyes narrowing as she spotted a flicker of movement in an alleyway. "Not just scavengers. People. Other survivors. Don't trust anyone." Sarah gave her a brief nod, her face grim. "Agreed." They continued through the abandoned streets, their senses alert, each of them feeling the growing weight of the uncertainty pressing in on them. The city had once been full of life, a bustling epicenter of human civilization. Now it was a place where death walked freely, human and undead alike. After what felt like hours, they finally reached the supply depot, a rusted old warehouse that had once stored everything from medical supplies to canned food. The place was isolated, tucked away from the main streets, and it was as good a hiding spot as any. Sarah pulled the vehicle into the loading dock, the screech of the brakes echoing in the silence. "Stay sharp," she said. "We don't know what we're walking into." The group disembarked cautiously, weapons at the ready. The area was deserted, eerily quiet, but there was something about the stillness that set their nerves on edge. The warehouse doors were cracked open, a faint light shining from within, but the smell was unmistakable, a blend of mildew, rust, and something worse. The last thing they wanted to find was more death. "Looks clear," Maria said, her voice barely a whisper. "Let's move." They approached the door, and Sarah pushed it open, gun raised. The warehouse was a mess. Shelves were toppled, and boxes were strewn everywhere. Yet, amid the chaos, there were signs of recent activity, fresh footprints in the dust, discarded food wrappers, and a few scattered cans of food. "Someone's been here," Derek noted, moving cautiously toward a stack of boxes. "If they've left, then maybe we'll still find something useful." Ethan was still leaning heavily on Maria for support, his face pale and sweat beading at his forehead. His breath was coming in shallow, labored gasps. "If we don't find something soon," his voice trailed off, the weight of the unspoken words hanging in the air. "Stay with us, Ethan," Maria said firmly, her eyes locked on his. "You're not getting off that easy." Sarah moved through the room, checking every corner, her gun poised. "There's something off about this place," she muttered, her instincts screaming at her. It's too quiet. Then, from the back of the warehouse, a faint sound broke the silence, a low groan. It was soft at first, barely perceptible, but then it grew louder. A shuffle of feet. It was coming toward them. Damn it, Sarah hissed under her breath, signaling for the group to fall back. The sound grew closer, more than one. Then, from the shadows of a storage room, they appeared. A small group of zombies, sluggish and hungry, emerging from the dark corners of the warehouse. The survivors sprang into action. Maria was the first to fire, taking down the closest one with a precise shot to the head. Sarah followed suit, her own pistol barking as she cleared another. But there were too many, far more than they had expected. The survivors began to retreat, but Sarah's heart sank as she realized there was no easy escape. They were surrounded. The survivors were trapped. The groans of the zombies filled the warehouse, echoing off the walls as more of the undead emerged from the dark corners, their lifeless eyes locked onto the group. Their slow, shambling movements only made them more terrifying, as they spread across the room, blocking every possible escape route. The survivors had fought countless battles, but this felt different. They had nowhere to go. Back to the door. Sarah shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. She fired her pistol, taking out one of the closest zombies with a single shot to the head, but more seemed to appear in its place. Derek, already moving toward the exit, was quickly surrounded by two infected, their hands reaching out for him with hunger. He swung his pipe, knocking one back, but the other latched onto his leg, sinking its teeth into his flesh. He cried out in pain, instinctively trying to shake the creature off, but the bite was deep, and the infection would spread fast. Derek! Sarah screamed, her eyes widening in horror as she watched him struggle. Without hesitation, she rushed forward, firing 3 quick shots into the zombie's skull. It collapsed, but not before Derek had already stumbled, weakened by the pain. Maria quickly moved in, yanking Derek to his feet and helping him limp toward the door. "We need to move," she urged, her voice taut with urgency. She had no time to check if Derek's wound was fatal. She only had one goal in mind now, getting them out of the warehouse alive. Ethan, still clutching his injured arm, fought through the pain to keep up. His vision swam with dizziness, but he knew if he collapsed now, he would never get back up. I'm fine," he muttered to himself as he stumbled forward, his breath ragged. With the zombies closing in, the group pushed forward, desperately trying to make it to the exit. But just as they neared the back door, it slammed open with a deafening crash. Another group of survivors stood at the entrance, their weapons drawn. But these weren't scavengers. These were armed, well-prepared individuals, militia, by the looks of their tactical vests and military-grade rifles. The group froze, unsure whether to be relieved or suspicious. "Move! Get inside now," barked the leader, a tall, burly woman with dark hair tied in a tight ponytail. She wasn't wasting any time, stepping forward to grab Sarah by the arm. "You want to live? Follow us." Without waiting for an answer, the militia woman shoved Sarah and the others into the building behind her. The rest of the survivors poured in, with the zombies hot on their heels. The militia leader slammed the door shut behind them, and the sound of pounding on metal echoed through the walls. For a brief moment, they were safe. But only for a moment. "We don't have much time," the woman said, her tone firm and commanding. "This place is on borrowed time. You've got 5 minutes to grab what you need. After that, we're leaving." Sarah was still reeling from the sudden appearance of their saviors, or were they enemies? But for now, survival took precedence. She turned to her group. "Grab everything you can. Let's move fast." Derek, though clearly in pain, was still on his feet. He limped over to a table stacked with medical supplies, grabbing what he could. "We can't just trust them," he muttered, clearly trying to make sense of the situation. "I know," Sarah replied quietly, "but we don't have a choice." Maria and Ethan, still weary from their earlier encounters, moved through the warehouse with military precision. They gathered food, water, and anything that could be of use. The sound of the zombies outside was growing louder, but the militia held their ground, weapons aimed at the door as they prepared for the next wave. The minutes felt like hours as they scrambled to collect their supplies. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the militia had their own agenda. Why had they come? And why had they chosen to save them? She needed answers, but there was no time. Finally, the militia leader motioned for them to stop. "Enough," she said. "We're leaving." She led them out of the back of the warehouse into a hidden alley, where a van was parked. The group piled in, the door slamming shut behind them. The vehicle started with a roar, and they sped off into the night, leaving the chaos of the warehouse behind them. As the city faded into the distance, Sarah sat in the back with Maria and Derek, Ethan leaning against the side of the van, eyes closed. They were safe, for now. "We're not out of this yet," Sarah muttered, her voice low. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were just trading one danger for another. The world outside was full of unknowns, and the militia's sudden appearance only added to the questions swirling in her mind. "We'll make it," Maria said, her voice calm but determined. "We've survived this long. We'll survive whatever comes next." But even as she said it, Sarah could see the doubt in her eyes. The truth was, no one knew what the future held. All they could do was keep moving forward, one step at a time. And hope that the next time, they wouldn't be out of time.